Willkommen bei den Europäischen Literaturtagen 2017. Begegnungen mit Literatur, Begegnungen in der Wachau. Vom 16. bis 19. November treffen sich bereits zum 9. Mal internationale Autoren und Literaturexperten hier im Klangraum Minoritenkirche Krems sowie im Schloss zu Spitz an der Donau, um neue Bücher vorzustellen und sich aus ihren literarischen Blickwinkeln über drängende Fragen unserer Gegenwart auszutauschen. Flucht aus dem Paradies. Deborah Levy, britische Schriftstellerin, bekannt für ihren schonungslosen Blick und die Eleganz ihrer Sprache, spricht über die Angst vor Bindung und Melancholie. Anschließend kommt die in London lebende türkische Schriftstellerin Elif Shafak zu Wort. Ihr Thema ist der Kampf zwischen Tradition und Moderne. Im Rahmen dieser literarischen Soiree überreicht der Präsident des Hauptverbandes des österreichischen Buchhandels, Benedikt Vöger, den diesjährigen Ehrenpreis für Toleranz in Denken und Handeln an Elif Shafak. Den Abend moderiert Rosie Goldsmith.
You really have got a very special evening in store tonight, as Walter was saying, and Bürgermeister as well, that we have got two great Europeans tonight. And that is not an easy thing for me to say, coming from the UK. It is very, very difficult at the moment in the UK. And you have the luxury of talking about fear and so on. We have one topic, which we're not going to talk about tonight, but it is Brexit, and it is part of this big European story. We don't want to leave you. We really don't. Anyway, so there we are. We'll enjoy them while you can. Enjoy our great Europeans while you can. And two great women as well, too, which is even more special for me. Now, we're going to talk about the theme of fear, and we're going to talk about the headline of the debate, which is Paradise Lost. But each lady will talk about it in a very different way, I think. Now, the message, though, at the end is, and this is, I think, a very British thing in many ways, it's a positive message at the end. We're not actually all about gloom and doom, are we, Deborah?
Maybe we are.
A little bit. Because we're European, maybe that's why. Now, Deborah...
I think you can't write without angst. Because when we write, there would be no story if everybody was feeling fine and happy and had no problems. So angst is part of writing.
But you know, there are very few places in the UK where you can actually go onto a stage and immediately talk about angst. You know, you have to build up to it for quite at least half an hour. But here we're going straight in because we're in the best place for it. So what does fear mean to you?
Oh.
You started it.
Okay. Well, writers have the fear of sort of not knowing what's going to happen next. I'm going to start with my craft before I kind of make big statements about fear. So there is always some sort of uncertainty in writing, because although I might map the work, and I always leave some holes in the map. So I want to get from here to there. but I leave some spaces in the map because otherwise there's nothing for me to find out. And sometimes, if you have a deadline and you have to deliver a book at a certain time, there really is fear that you're not going to rise, to it. But I think Freud had an interesting angle on fear, which I find quite comforting, which is that when we have this feeling of real dread and foreboding in our stomachs, the thing that we most fear has already happened. It's about something in the past. And somehow that feels kind of true. Fear can be good for us. It can be energizing. It can bring communities together to solve problems. Fear in families is very interesting. Sometimes it's the most vulnerable person in a family, actually, who has the most power, because they create the most fear.
They suck the energy out of the rest of the family, don't they? They're like some sponges.
Yes. So it's a very interesting subject, but I think the main fear is, in the bigger sense, is of isolation from the bigger world of ideas and problem solving and comfort.
Well, let me just go in from the other way round now and just introduce a few of the ideas that Deborah has introduced into our world, which without her wouldn't exist because her writing is so beautiful. Several books have been translated into German, so you already have, I think, quite a few that you can read. But we're going to be talking mostly about Black Vodka tonight, which is Deborah's collection of short stories. But I've just got to do my usual thing where the author has to sit there and be praised and nod and be very understanding, but I really do want to tell you a little bit about her. Now, even in 1985, very, very early on in Deborah's career, she was a playwright, wrote prose and then several plays as well, very, very brilliant plays which were performed at the Royal Shakespeare Company. 1985, the very first quote I found about Deborah still holds true today. Innovative, full of raw energy and passionate engagement. And I think that describes everything that she has written. And another favourite, which in many ways, which is about Black Vodka, the short stories, which they're miniatures rendered epic by their scope and profundity. Because they're never big books, they're not long stories. Sometimes, as in one story here, it's only 6 paragraphs. I think. So, but I know there's a lot of meticulous planning and so on that goes into it. She's also the mistress of the first line. Read every first line of Deborah. You'll never, ever be disappointed. Now, Deborah Levy is a poet, a playwright, and an author, novelist. She was born and brought up in South Africa, which we discovered a few years ago we had in common. But Deborah's father was a political prisoner, and they were then in exile. They had to leave South Africa. She's written 6 novels, short stories, essays, radio plays, as I say, several plays for the RSC, and 2, in recent times, major novels, which were shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize in the UK, which is our biggest literature prize. Swimming Home in 2011, which is called Heimschwimmen in German. Not sure about that title, but Heimschwimmen. And then Hot Milk, Heiße Milch, in 2016, so last year.
Next year.
Next year, sorry, yeah. That's coming out in German next year. It came out in the UK. And the names that you hear Deborah associated with, when she grapples with, are George Orwell, for instance, Virginia Woolf. She's been compared with Virginia Woolf as well. Rob Grier, Freud, she's already talked about Freud, Jung. So these are really European engagements, if you like, literary engagements. And there is a wonderful essay that you wrote called, which was based on, you gave a response to Orwell's, as in Why I Write, his 1946 essay, which is absolutely brilliant. If you get the chance to read that, that's not translated, I don't think, but
No, not yet.
it?
That's called Things I Don't Want to Know. And what I mean by that are that the things that we don't want to know are the things that we sort of know anyway, but kind of push down. So it's not the same as kind of not wanting to know that sharks are the only fish that can blink.
it's true.
and stuff like that.
It's a great essay.
And in fact, the sequel to that essay comes out in Britain with Hamish Hamilton Penguin next year, and that's called The Cost of Living.
Now, just very briefly to get us into Black Vodka, let's talk about Swimming Home, because Swimming Home does lead us very well into Black Vodka, I think. Swimming Home is, I think we can say that now, a very traditional Deborah Levy story, because it starts with what seems like a very familiar story. It's a middle-class family, and they're on holiday in the south of France. It's what we all do, apparently. In the UK, we go on holiday in the south of France. And so it starts off in very familiar ways, and then it becomes more and more strange. It becomes quite surreal, and the story then takes off after that. Is that fair if I call it dare I say, a typical Deborah Levy story? Do you see your work in that way?
No. I think with Swimming Home, I wanted to subvert a cliche. I wanted to start with something that everyone would recognize. A family holiday, a stranger comes to stay and causes chaos. So everybody is sort of wired up to understand that story. We've heard it over and over. And I wanted to look at two characters, a middle-aged man, a very famous poet, who was born in Poland and had to leave Poland when he was 5. He's Jewish, and he smuggled through the woods to Whitechapel, to East London. And his father says to him, "You can never come home. You cannot come home." And this is said to him with love. But we usually say that in anger to someone. Go away. You can't come back. So he's got a problem with love. So I wanted to look at that. He's also a very melancholy man. And I made him disguise that by being cheerful, very, always making jokes, talking all the time, because it's the quiet ones that are interesting. So silence is a very big theme in all my work. And a young woman, a very fragile young woman called Kitty Finch, comes to this villa in the south of France, and she has a poem in her hand, and he's a famous poet, so she wants him to read it. But he knows that it's a kind of threat. So I look at the power of fragility, at her fragility, and I just give 3 lines of her poem, which is, my mother says, I am the only jewel in her crown, but now I've made her tired with all my etc. So now she walks with sticks.
And there are many memorable lines in Deborah's work. And the reason I wanted to briefly talk about Swimming Home is because many of those ideas that you look at later in Black Vodka and in other novels like Home, these lost souls as well, too. Joe is a lost soul. Kitty and Joe come together in a way because they're both lost and fragile.
This is true. This is absolutely true, what Rose is saying. So the theme that Kitty always says is we hope that life is only worth living because we hope it'll get better and that we'll all get home safely.
Yes. That's actually, but that's quite positive, I think, too. But then there are also the issues of mental health and relationships between men and women, and the idealised version of women too, because Kitty is really thin, if not anorexic, but she has big breasts, so it's kind of like the male fantasy of a woman in many ways too. And I think that's something that, having read the two one after another, Swimming Home and then Black Vodka, I was inclined to see quite a few similarities with the themes.
I think Kitty Finch, the Swimming Home has been translated now into about 15 languages. And as I tour around with it, there is a very big response from young women who feel that they have... Kitty Finch has a lot of dignity because really her mind is her wealth. She is really smart. And I confuse it because a lot of the attention from Joseph is on her body.
Joe.
He's Joe sometimes and Joseph, so these names sort of slide.
Because he's a good old Middle European. Now, Black Vodka. Now, these are 10 short stories, and they've been collected. You wrote them over various periods of time. They've been collected into an absolutely stunning collection of stories. So do please read these. You will not be disappointed. Remember, look out for the first lines. But they're very much tied together with I would call it the Deborah Levy sort of trademark, if that doesn't sound too much like branding. But they are very European. They actually take place in European cities. So you're in Paris, you're in Prague, you're in Rome, Zurich, I think. There are Russians, there are Poles, there are every possible nationality. Everybody's coming together. There are many languages, many cultures. And it's about how they respond to the past. These people, like Joe, like the Black Vodka salesman right at the front, who's talking about his past, his history, his Polish history as well. Let's hear the opening story, which is the title story, Black Vodka, and you'll hear why Black Vodka is the top. I'm going to talk about it afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so as Rosie says, the title story is Black Vodka. And I think as a writer, I'm trying to find techniques to make the past and the present coexist at the same time, so that I don't go once upon a time, or I don't end a chapter in the present and start in another time. So a lot of writing is really about how to handle time. And this is set in London, and the main character is in a way inspired by Victor Hugo's The Hunchback of Notre Dame. So I always felt always a lot of interest in Quasimodo, The Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I thought, what happens if I put him in a suit and give him a job in the 21st century? And I'll make him work in an advertising agency. And so this is him talking. The first time I met Lisa, I knew she was going to help me become a very different sort of man. Knowing this felt like a summer holiday. It made me relax, and I am quite a tense person. There is something you should know about me. I have a little hump on my back, a mound between my shoulder blades. You will notice when I wear a shirt without a jacket that there is more to me than first meets the eye. It's strange how fascinating human beings find both celebrity and deformity in their own species. People sink their eyes into my hump for 6 seconds longer than protocol should allow, and try to work out the difference between myself and them. So,
I'm going to start exactly where I am now. Life is beautiful. Vodka is black. Pears are naked. Rain is horizontal. Moths are ghosts. Only some of this is true, but you should know that this does not scare me as much as the promise of love.
Thank you.
One of the best readers we have, and it is always a pleasure to listen to Deborah. Now there are so many issues, and of course we're going to have to glide over several of them, but the archaeology of the past, which most of your characters, you spoke about Joe earlier as well, most of them are excavating the past, or they try to hide it and then they come up against it again. It doesn't go away. And it's primarily the European past. When did you start writing about this and why?
Yes, I just have to say that was a very long story. I realized it was 17 pages long, so I hope when I skipped it, it sort of made a little bit of a bit of sense.
And they all speak such wonderful English that I'm sure they were jumping along with you, skipping along with you.
Skipping along. I think that for all of us, the past and the present do exist simultaneously, because you're thinking about tomorrow when you're bored. You know, what am I doing tomorrow? And and you're thinking about something that happened to you 10 years ago, and you're sitting on a bus, and you're thinking, if only I hadn't handled that situation like that. And you make up a new situation where you really give the best line. You make up something excellent that you didn't say. If only I'd said that. So all the past, in a way, and I'll go back to Freud here. Freud said that the past, when we daydream, we make little corrections to reality. So the idea that we only have one memory is not true. Because when we reconstruct the past, we have 3, 4, 5 memories, many more of the past, of the same memory. So that interests me. That interests me a lot. My grandparents were from Lithuania and never talked about. That really hardly ever talked about their childhoods. My grandmother never talked about it. So silence is another subject in all my books, and humour, because I really do think that life is not worth living without laughing a lot.
And you are very funny.
So,
I mean, there's always a lot of humour.
Yeah.
But then I mean, you talk about, European history. This is a European, it's a collection of European stories and languages and cultures. And there's one character in the short story which is actually called Vienna, which in some ways, if we had time, that's the story that Deborah should be reading as well. It's set in Vienna, but the characters are a mixture of Italian, Russian, they would house in Zurich, or the males could have, and they don't even know which language is their first language. So it's a kind of hodgepodge of cosmopolitanism and so on too. But that's very much what you're describing in this book as well, is a kind of global, the new global reality, if you like, and how to a certain degree we are forgetting our past, as they do in Vienna as well.
Yeah, I mean, and 3 of them are set in London, here's an example. They get married, a young man and woman get married. Elisa said yes, and I said yes. We said yes in all the European languages. We said yes to vague but powerful things. We said yes to hope, which has to be vague. We said yes to love, which is always blind. we smiled and said yes without blinking. So I'm quite interested in those ideas that love is always blind. Because if we were all seeing and wise, we would probably risk nothing. We would just be scared all the time. And that hope is always vague. It has to be. And these are themes that do run through my book, and it is channeled through many experiences.
And the people you describe, the men and the women, equally, they often have something they're hiding, like a hunchback or a rash or something. They're hiding things, or they're deformed, or they've got a mental illness, and these are things also that are just there below the surface.
Yeah, not all of them. I mean, I would say that I'm very interested in how we construct masculinity and how we construct femininity. Because if you look at some of the conversations that we've had today, it seems to me that that if you look at the macho culture of fascism, which conceals so much fragility and vulnerability, and the sort of harder it gets, you could sort of say that masculinity is a perversion, or you could say that the patriarchy is a sort of perversion, and that if you could just if we could lose this performance, this macho performance of masculinity, because the patriarchy has never been very good for men or children or women. So these are hard. These are not new ideas, but they're not ideas that are said very openly. So I don't explore it like that in my book. Men feel things that are right and that are wrong, but they feel things, and they're vulnerable, and they're strong, and so are the women. And they come into collision with each other, with their past and their present. And so you could say that a lot of my books are a theatre of behaviour, really. I'm interested in behaviour.
And I think that, I know that you feel very strongly about we've been talking a lot in the UK about, we've had so many issues, I'm sure you've had them here too, about Me Too, this whole, these issues that came out after the Harvey Weinstein scandal, and they continue. And we are talking a lot about it. It actually made me, when I was rereading these stories too, made me see these stories in a different light too, because that is something that you're looking at all the time. But also from a very psychological aspect. You're a wonderful psychologist. And that's why I sort of say quite often it's hidden, and maybe the men you're describing find it difficult, much more difficult to express themselves. Or there's the one male character in one of the most extraordinary stories who he feels he doesn't have a character, and he takes on the traumas, Nick and Tom.
Oh yeah.
And I love it when authors don't remember their own books. They've written a long time. This is a good story.
This is a story called Stardust Nation,
which is a great story.
And it's also just been made into a graphic novel.
Well, you've written it.
Yes. So the artist is the professor at the Royal College of Art called Andrzej Klimowski, and he's the artist, and I've written the text. And Stardust Nation explores this idea. If you look at a bully in a playground, what's going on? The bully can't feel whatever it is that he or she feels. He can't do it. So he has to get someone else to feel for him, to feel as frightened, as angry, as powerless, as unvalued as he does. So he starts to bully to make someone else feel what it is he is feeling. So I thought, can I write a short story in which a very elegant man called Tom Mines, who is quite bullied, who himself was bullied, who had a very violent father. But I wanted the readers to like him. Could he make someone else feel, on his behalf, everything he felt about his childhood, and have the readers absolutely understand what's happening on every single page? And this was the hardest story I ever wrote. It's a short story of about 12 pages. I think it took me 2 years on and off to write it because it's such a hard thing to do. And it's now going to be a film as well. So it's the relationship between two men exploring how one man gets another man to feel for him.
By proxy, really.
Yes. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary story, and also because it leads to, I mean, this is, again, you do write a lot about depression and mental illness and trauma in men as well as women, and this is probably the strongest in that sense, and the freakiest, really, too.
Well, I think everybody, the world is full of depression and of people who are depressed and who need things. So you can't really not have characters in books who just have no problems whatsoever. So I wouldn't say that that's sort of entirely my subject, but certainly there is always the catch for me is I'm writing a book at the moment. My new novel is called The Man Who Saw Everything. And it's about an amazing man. I'm already in love with him, writing this book. But he has one problem. He's a little bit careless. When he crosses the road, he doesn't look left to right enough. He's a bit careless with his wife. He's a bit careless with his children. So I'm looking at carelessness as a subject through a character that I love, and I hope to make you love.
And they will, because it's also set in Berlin too, part of it too. So you can never leave Europe alone. Just to end very quickly, I wonder whether you do me an enormous favour and read my favourite paragraph from the whole collection, the short stories, your Mitteleuropa paragraph from Vienna. Would you just do that to conclude? That would be so great. This is from the short story I was telling you about, Vienna. And it is an example of Deborah's great poetry as well. She is first and foremost a great poet.
So this is a man who is in love with a woman from Vienna, and he's sort of very overwhelmed by her, and I think that I don't think there's much of a future in it for him, and he's just looking at her and admiring her. And he says, she is Middle Europe, she is Vienna, she is Austria, she is a silver teaspoon, she's cream, she's schnapps, she is strudel dusted with white icing sugar, she is a velvet curtain, she is made from the horn of deer found deep in the pine forests of Middle Europe. She smells of burnt sugar, she is snow, she is fur, she is leather, she is gold, she is someone else's property. He holds out his arms, inviting her back to her own bed, inviting Middle Europe to share her wealth, to let him steal some of her silver, to let him make footprints across her snow and drink her schnapps.
Deborah Levy!
Thank you, Rosie. Thank you.
It's a great ending. Great ending. I have to get to sign it one day, I think. It's always difficult doing something like that about somebody you know, and they have to sit and listen to you and say they like it even when it was difficult. Elif, it is a great honour to hold that for you and also to talk to you now about your work, about this wonderful book, Three Daughters of Eve, and all your other work. When you hear those words like homeland and storyland and so on, which is the most important for you? Is it storyland, or is it the issues? Is it the political? Is it the activism, or is it the stories? Which comes first for you?
First of all, allow me to thank you, really, for every word, every single word. I feel very, very honored.
Every word is true.
And very welcome. So I'm most thankful, most grateful. I think storyland is the crucial word for me, and oftentimes I felt more at home in storyland than maybe even in my own motherland. But this is a feeling that goes all the way back to my childhood. As you mentioned, I was born in France. I came to Turkey with my mom. I was raised by a single mother, which I think left a big impact on my life, my work. Actually, I was raised by two women. My mother, who was very westernized, very modern, very secularist, urban, and then my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was the exact opposite. And somehow these two women supported each other, and there was solidarity between them. I observed that solidarity, and I am grateful to that solidarity because it had an impact not only on my mother's life, but also my life, even probably my children's lives as well. In the sense that when my mother came back from France, she was very young. She had got married at the age of 19, imagine. So she had dropped out of university, thinking love was enough, love was all she needed. And of course, when the marriage failed and she came back with a toddler in her arms, she had no diploma, no career, no money, nowhere to go to. And usually women in such situations are immediately married off, preferably to someone much older than themselves, because they're not very favorable anymore in the marital market. They're not virgins anymore. And so people were immediately looking for alternative or second husbands for my mother, because a single young woman is regarded as a danger in a society like that. And I have to tell you that we came back to Ankara, to a very conservative, very religious, very patriarchal neighborhood. This was my maternal grandmother's house where she lived. And it was my grandmother who interfered, and she said, you know what, you don't have to do this. What you have to, in my opinion, you should go back to university, she said to my mother. You should have a diploma, you should have a career, you should have choices. If you want to get married, you can always do that whenever you want, but then it will become a choice, not an obligation. And in the meantime, while you become a student again, she said to my mother, I'm going to take care of my grandchild. So I was raised by my maternal grandmother in my early years, whom I called mother, and my own mother I called abla, which in Turkish means big sister. It was very, very confusing to everyone, but to me it was somehow, very clear. But the reason why I'm mentioning is because they were different culturally, spiritually, intellectually, and yet they supported each other. And as a result, my mother graduated from university. She then became a diplomat, and she and I traveled a lot together. Thanks to that, I was able to have a good education. And so my grandmother's faith in her daughter's education changed lives of generations of children to come. There's always a part of me that's looking for sisterhood, for that kind of solidarity. So yes, Storyland is a basic concept for me, but I think so is sisterhood.
So, I mean, there are two issues there. You've spoken about women, a lot of women's issues, and it is probably, of all, for us at the moment, it is such a big and burning issue for everybody. And in fact, interestingly enough, when you were kind enough to say how beautiful Elif, which of course we all know Elif is very beautiful, but it's almost difficult to say that now, isn't it? Because it's become language has become so loaded, life for women has become so complicated. Life for men is complicated, but these issues which come to the fore in this book, in all your books too, about how women are treated in society, were treated in history, and are treated today, and your lectures and everything you do comes back to a pretty basic issue about how we are together.
Yeah, I think we tend to forget the very simple fact that as human beings, our main element is water. You know, we are composed of water. A big chunk of our brains is composed of water. Our element is water. Life is based on water, in my opinion. And so that means we are fluid. So when we talk about gender, we forget that it's fluid. We think of it as solid bricks, women versus men. You know, this is women's area, this is... What exactly does that mean? I think we all have both energies inside, feminine and masculine. It's just a matter of degrees. And the same person can have varying degrees throughout his or her life. So the degrees of femininity and masculinity are not stable either. So for me, seeing identity as a monolithic, solid thing is quite problematic. I don't like identity, and I don't like identity politics. What I like is fluid, multiple belongings. And I think we live in an age in which we have to fight for this. Because we are being, through many channels, we are being pushed to a corner in which we have to make a choice almost, you know, either or choice, in which we are being asked to reduce ourselves to a single monolithic identity. All around the world, extremists want to do this. They say, are you a Muslim? Then you can only be a Muslim according to their definition of Islam. Are you a Dutch? You can only be Dutch. Are you this? Why can't we be multiple things? I've always thought of myself as, you know, circles, like my grandmother's circles. So of course I'm an Istanbulite, I'm attached to Istanbul, but I'm also attached to the Aegean, to the Mediterranean, to the Levant, to the Middle East, as you mentioned. By choice, by birth, I see myself as a European, and the values that I uphold are core European values, in my opinion. I have become a Londoner over the years, and I would like to see myself as a global soul. Why not? So many, many, many belongings. May I care for many things at the same time?
Did you, I mean, you started off as, I mean, you were very young when you first published. I mean, you were in your very early 20s, and you published in Turkish.
Yeah.
And did you think that you would just continue writing novels? Did you ever contemplate that you would start being as politically active as you are? Because there must still be a bit of a balancing act going on for you, because you do write a lot, and you write great novels, but you're also very, very active in public life.
I think there were two stages. I started writing at a very early age, relatively speaking. You know, I was a child. I started at the age of 8. And I did not stop since then. But that's not because I wanted to become a novelist. I didn't know such a thing was possible. There were no writers around me. There were no writers in the family. So it never occurred to me that you can dedicate your life to literature. But I started writing because I was an only child. I was a lonely child. I thought my life was terribly boring. And so when my mother... And I had an imagination like many children, so when my mother gave me a diary, telling me to keep, to write down, I thought there was nothing to write. The reality was so boring. And immediately I started making up things that never really occurred, writing about people who didn't really exist. And therefore from diaries into short stories, and then from short stories into novels, it evolved. The desire to become a writer and fully dedicate myself to literature came to me in my late, I would say when I was 20 years old, 19 years old. And then I started publishing at a relatively age in Turkey. And it has been quite a turbulent path in many ways. Why do I say this? Because Turkey is a difficult terrain for writers. I think especially for women writers. We have a written culture that is very much male-dominated. So, and that's the irony, because most of the readers are women. Most fiction readers are women. So women read, but most writers, editors, critics, poets, people who manage, are in editorial positions, they are male. So women read, men write. In this position, especially back then when I was younger, I found it very, very difficult. There is a lot of sexism, a lot of homophobia, a lot of patriarchy. But the trouble is, the literary world looks different on the surface. it looks more progressive, it looks more liberal. When you scratch the surface underneath, it's equally sexist and patriarchal as the rest of the country. But it takes a while to recognize that.
You started writing in a time when things were on the surface relatively progressive and good, at least in our terms, for Turkey. And it was a good time to write. It was a good time to be out there enjoying art and culture and so on. And everything seemed to be going fine. Now, also in this novel, you started off in the 1980s, where Perrin, the main character, is growing up in that time, and then she goes to Oxford to study and so on too. But you can see in this novel too that beneath the surface there are these tensions, and they are shown very much in the relationship between the mother and the father. Again, you manage to, you always slip in some really strong ideas into all your writing. So tell us about that, because this is also, you then bring it up to the modern day, 2016, and again, things happen. The coup happened just as you were writing that, I think, the 2016 coup. So there's been a kind of contemporaneity about this. There's always been something parallel happening to reflect what your life, but also in this novel.
I think Turkey is quite turbulent in so many ways. I mean, we never had a proper democracy. But of course, over the last years, everything became worse and worse. Increasingly, we've been sliding backwards. And I mentioned this before. I think when societies go backwards into nationalism, religious fundamentalism, populism, I think women have much more to lose than men. So when you see an increase in nationalism, you also see an increase in sexism. These are not coincidental. They trigger each other. And for writers, I think, on the one hand, it is quite a challenging atmosphere, but on the other hand, it can be quite heartwarming and rewarding as well, if I may mention this. Because in countries like Turkey, a book is not an individual item. You know, you read a book, and if you like a book, you pass it on. You give it to your sister or to your aunt, and the aunt sends it to his son who is doing his military service, and the son shares it with his best friend. So on book signings, I would look at the books people would bring for me to sign, and they have been underlined by different colored pens because they have been read by different people. That's quite interesting. So there's this almost beautiful energy coming from the readers. I mentioned this earlier. I think being a writer in Turkey is like being slapped on one cheek and kissed on the other cheek, because you get that love from the readers, and at the same time the harshness, the slap, especially from the elite all the time. It's a very dizzying experience. And I think I have reflected a lot of that schizophrenia, fragmentation that I observed in Turkish society in this book.
And it does really speak to us now. It's just been translated. Interestingly, the titles, I think, the title in German is The Smell of Paradise,
yes.
Which I'm assured that the word Geruch is actually a neutral word, but for me it sounds a tiny bit negative. Is it at all negative? Geruch? Der Geruch des Paradieses? No, totally neutral. So it's the smell of paradise, not the perfume, but the smell of paradise.
Well, to be honest, I mean, as those of you who have read the book would remember, there's a big, long dinner scene, supper scene in this book. So there is starters, the main course, dessert, and as the main character goes back with flashbacks, we travel to Oxford, and I can make this comparison between Oxford and Istanbul. In a way, Oxford is a place of memory, continuity, where history is welcome, and Istanbul, in my opinion, is a place of ruptures. Even though it has a strong history, we have collective amnesia in Turkey. So I wanted to be able maybe to compare those things. But the reason I mention it is because this supper scene was very important for me. And everything that I observed throughout the year 2015, 2016 in Turkey, I directly heard, saw, observed, is in that dinner scene, that long supper scene. So much so that at some point I wanted to call the book The Last Supper of the Turkish Bourgeoisie.
So titles are important.
Some titles are important, but my editor convinced me not to do that.
Oh,
so.
I think it would have been a fine title. But this is also a very fine title because it is about one of your great obsessions, but in all your books you write about some form of spirituality or religion. And these three women, three very different Muslims, are, the believer, as we were talking about before, and the atheist and so on. Are they different aspects of you? Is it part of you sort of continuing your own spiritual quest?
I think
because I know you do that. You've spoken about that before in your novels. You are exploring belief and your own feeling about God and belief.
But I think there's I want to be able to talk about this in a nuanced way, and I am worried that we are losing nuances because we are being trapped into dualities. Even on both sides of the Atlantic, both in America and in England and in Europe, I have listened to so many conversations, debates in academia between a firmly theist scholar and a firmly atheist scholar, but it's not a real intellectual exchange. And I find that after a while, very repetitive, because everybody just sticks to their, guns, and nobody is really willing to change. And in an intellectual exchange, you have to be ready to be changed. You have to be ready to be transformed. It has to be more liquid. But if I may come back to the title of the book, Three Daughters of Eve, we always talk about the sons of Adam. Where were the daughters of Eve? When I look at the three monotheistic religions. So I guess I like to, in all my works, I like to try to find the forgotten ones. The ones that are not mentioned, the ones that are erased, the ones that are pushed to the periphery. I want to bring that periphery to the center. Those whose voices have been erased, I want to give them more voice. I try to tell the story from their perspective, whether it's historical or today. And that's why it's Three Daughters of Eve. With regards to faith, I find it very difficult to talk about these issues in Turkey, because in Turkey there is this assumption that you're either very religious, or if you're a secularist, you should have no interest whatsoever in these debates. But if you're a novelist, you are interested in God, faith, mortality. You don't have to be religious in order to be interested in these issues. Personally, I'm not even a believer. I'm not a religious person. I'm not even a believer. But I see myself as someone who's closer to agnostics and mystics and maybe misfits, people who were like on the periphery of, walking a very thin line between blasphemy and faith, sometimes tripping over this side and that side. My problem with very absolutely, rigidly religious people is they want to get rid of doubt. And I think faith without doubt is a very dangerous thing, because it's dogma, and dogmas are dangerous. On the other hand, my problem with rigidly atheist people is they want to get rid of faith. But there are secular acts of faith in our lives. Like when you start writing a novel, this is an act of faith. It has nothing to do with religion. When you move to a new country, you don't really know why you're doing it, but you do it anyhow. It is an act of faith. When you fall in love, it is an act of faith. You don't even know if this person is going to make you happy, but you do it anyhow. There are these irrational acts in our lives that are connected to little pockets of faith. So what I'm trying to say is I like the dance between faith and doubt, but not the certainty of the religious or the certainty of the atheists. So in this book, I think I wanted to highlight confusion. It's okay to be confused.
And definitely, and I think that's, if you've been here all day, you'll know that is actually what we've been talking about all day, the need for more nuance and less dogma. And that is the way we've been talking about education and so on too. It's absolutely the message of the day. Would you be kind to read a short extract for us from this wonderful book?
Well, thank you. So the parts that I will be reading is, this section is about Peri's family. As we mentioned, her mother is quite religious and her father is a secularist. He is a man who believes in enlightenment, in the education of his daughter. He's a Democrat, and like many Democrats in Turkey, he is deeply, deeply depressed. And his name is Mensur. Her parents were as incompatible as tavern and mosque. The frowns that descended on their brows, the stiffness that infused their voices, identified them not as a couple in love, but as opponents in a game of chess. On the faded board of their marriage, they each pushed forward, strategizing the next moves, capturing castles, elephants, and viziers, aiming to deliver the ultimate defeat. Each side saw the other as the tyrant in the family, the intolerable one, and longed to say, someday, checkmate, Shahmanad, the sovereign is helpless. Their marriage had been so deeply woven with mutual resentment that they no longer needed a reason to feel wronged and frustrated. Even at that young age, Peri sensed that love was not, and probably never had been, the reason why her parents were together. Sitting by herself in a corner, a heaviness of heart would come over Peri. She often wondered what it was that made her father so sad. She imagined sorrow sticking to him like a fine layer of black tar under the sole of his shoe. She could neither find a way to lift his spirits nor stop trying, for she was, as everyone in the family would testify, her father's daughter.
Beautiful. Now, you wrote that in English. You wrote that novel in English, and you've been writing more recently in English, and you're writing it about Turkey again. How does that work? How does that function for you internally?
Yeah, it's quite interesting actually, because I started learning English at the age of 10. At the time, Spanish was my second language, English was my third language. So I did not grow up bilingual. When I observe my children who are more truly bilingual and who always make fun of my mispronunciation, the things I can never pronounce correctly in the English language.
So they correct you?
They correct me and they make fun of me all the time. But I can see, because
do they have English accents, your children?
Yeah, because they go to British schools, and they have always gone to school in England. When we moved to England, they were very tiny. So they do have British accents. But comparing myself to them and to people who are truly bilingual or multilingual, I can see I am a foreigner, I am a latecomer, and there is a gap in people like me between the mind and the tongue. And the mind always runs faster, and the tongue is trying to catch up. As foreigners, I think we always want to say more, and we end up saying less. And that gap is very frustrating. But I also think it's quite stimulating, if we learn not to be intimidated by that gap. It helps you to pay more attention to nuances, maybe the nuances that native speakers take for granted. I love languages, I've always saw myself as a commuter between languages. Over time I realized that in some ways I feel more attached to the English language in a more cerebral way. And in a more emotional way I feel attached to the Turkish language. Now, if I'm writing about sorrow, sadness, melancholy, longing, it's definitely much easier to write in Turkish. If there's irony, satire, sarcasm, humor, is definitely easier in English. And that made me think a lot. It's been now, I think, 13 years since I started writing in English. Ever since then, each novel was written in English first, and then it's being translated by a professional translator into Turkish, and then I take the Turkish translation and I rewrite it. So it's a bit insane, because you have to spend twice as much time almost, but I learn a lot from working closely with translators and the commute back and forth. If I may add this, Rosie, I think writing in English, interestingly, paradoxically, gave me a freedom, a zone of freedom. And by taking a step back, I was able to take a closer look at Turkey. So that cognitive distance, in fact, brought me closer to my motherland. I look at the titles of my books, the subjects that I write about, even The Bastard of Istanbul. The word bastard in Turkish, pitch, is so heavy. Had I written that book in Turkish, I could never dare to put that title on that book. But somehow, when you write in English, that emotional baggage disappears. And it's not only me. I have observed lots of women, Turkish women, living in England, in America, who can never swear in Turkish. And then I listen to them when they're speaking English. They're constantly using the F word, left and right, no guilt whatsoever. It's amazing. I mean, sometimes we express our anger in different languages. So I think it's quite interesting to see how we change as we move from one language to another. Because languages have an impact on us. I think even our body language changes.
Oh, absolutely. How do you engage with Turkey itself as a country? I mean, you live, I know you engage with Turkey as a country, but how do you actually do it? Because you do live in London, you travel a lot now around the world talking and so on. Just given the most wonderful TED talk, by the way, which you must listen to. That was your second TED talk. They're both available. I just had a recent look. The first one was called The Politics of Fiction.
Yeah.
And the second one was called The Revolution of
Radical Politics
of Diversity.
Revolutionary Thought of
Diversity, yes. I knew it was a complicated title.
It was a complicated one.
So do check those out, and they're both absolutely wonderful. But this engagement with Turkey as a country, when you don't live there, and this is also difficult because it is something that people sometimes hold against you. Yeah. You're writing about Turkey. Not everybody loves Elif. We all do, but she has a difficult time sometimes because people do criticize this very fact.
Yeah, I think even writing in English or writing critical articles in the Western world creates a backlash. It was interesting. I once read in an interview with Murakami where he mentions the more he became better known in the Western world, he said the more I was disliked in Japan. And I was thinking, wow, if he feels that way, so it's not a surprise.
Welcome to your world.
Welcome to our world. But I don't want to give you the wrong impression. So there's that, you know, we don't like. Had I been writing in Arabic, maybe they wouldn't react this much. But writing in a Western language, sometimes people say, "Why are you telling it to them?" As if we are a family, and whatever happens inside the family stays in the family. You know, this old 19th century definition of nationalism and nation state. We're a nation, okay, maybe there are honor killings in Turkey, maybe there's domestic violence, there's increasing rape or loss of women's rights, but don't tell it to them. Let's keep it in the family. And I don't understand that kind of nationalism. I've always been critical of that kind of nationalism. So there is that. The subjects that I deal with also get a lot of reaction. But I don't want to give the wrong impression because, as I said, when you connect with the people, it is completely different. And I have readers from very diverse backgrounds, which makes me very happy because when I look at the people waiting in line, these are not necessarily people who break bread together. We are a badly polarized society in Turkey. We live in our own little islands. Everybody has their own little angry neighborhood, and people don't necessarily talk to each other. There are lots of stereotypes about the other. So when I look at the people waiting in line, I see lots of women, liberals, leftists, secularists, but I also see, for instance, women with headscarves. I have lots of conservative readers. I see Sufis, Kurds, Turks, Alevis, Armenians, minorities, ethnic, sexual minorities. It's quite diverse. And the fact that people who don't talk to each other are reading the same book and hopefully finding something that resonates with them means a lot to me. Because I don't think we have too many spaces where we can still see people of different walks of life coming together in a society as badly divided as Turkey.
I think it's wonderful that when I was talking with Deborah Levy and now talking with you, that in spite of the difficulties of what we're going through in Europe, in spite of the difficulties of what we're going through, that both of you have been very positive. And I wonder, I mean, the theme of this whole seminar, these European Literature Days, is fear. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, you've spoken about several of these issues already without using the word fear, but it is there. Turkey is going through a quite horrific period, and there doesn't seem to be any let-up at the moment. It seems to be getting worse.
Yeah. For sure. Yeah.
And I wonder how you see this topic of fear as pertains to Turkey, to your writing and so on. I didn't want to just talk about Turkey and politics tonight. I did want to talk about the literature, which we've done, but I do now, I think we all need to hear what you feel about Turkey.
If I may start with Turkey and hopefully mention some other cases as well, but I really think Turkey is incredibly important. It's a very complicated country, and it's a very important country. And I think what happens in Turkey has repercussions beyond Turkey. I have met over the years lots of readers from Jordan, Lebanon, Kuwait, Pakistan, who would come and say, for us it was very important that Turkey was a different case, different model. And I think the loss of democracy in Turkey is a very depressing message for many liberals and Democrats in the region and beyond the region. And at the same time, I see it as a very multi-layered country. There is no doubt in my mind that unfortunately it has been going backwards. We became more nationalistic, more religious, more conservative, and more patriarchal. And at the same time, of course, Turkey became the world's biggest jailer for journalists today.
How many journalists are there? At least 100, I think.
Close to 160.
160.
Yeah. And at the same time, of course, in the past, China was holding this record. Now Turkey has surpassed China's sad record. At the same time, we have thousands of academics who were sacked, who lost their jobs just because they signed a peace petition. All they did was to sign a petition. And when I say sacked, we have to understand these people have no chance of finding another job at another university inside Turkey. And if they want to travel abroad and look for another job, many of them have their passports confiscated. And these people have families. Thousands of people have been lumped together and branded and stigmatized. There's no doubt in my mind that the coup attempt was wrong. Turkey's liberals, Democrats do not want another military takeover. I don't want another military takeover, but I don't want a civilian authoritarianism either. So I don't want coup, I don't want purge. I want a proper democracy, pluralistic democracy. So what we have in Turkey right now is thousands of people going through incredible difficulty. And you spoke about fear. I think there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of intimidation, especially for people who write, who speak up. Things became much more difficult. Surely for journalists, journalism is the most difficult profession in Turkey today. But in addition to that, as I said, academics, writers, intellectuals, at the end of the day, every journalist, every writer, every poet in Turkey knows that because of something you say in an interview, something you tweet, the very next day in the newspaper, you can be branded as a traitor. The word traitor is so easily used, and then people have all these conspiracy theories. You can be easily demonized. You can be easily sued, put on trial, arrested, or exiled. Now, because we know this at the back of our minds as artists, as writers, I think there's a lot of self-censorship. But self-censorship is a difficult subject to talk about because it's a bit embarrassing. How do you talk about the kind of fear that you have internalized?
And how do you know you're doing it?
And how do you know you're doing it?
Yes.
So
it's getting used to the fear as well. I mean, people get used to this kind of fear, and that's what I've heard from other Turkish colleagues as well. Yeah. They're not as alert to it as they were because it's become a situation they have to live with.
Yeah, I mean, regimes, authoritarian regimes, what they do, they either depoliticize people so that people say, okay, I don't want to think about this, I just want to repeat my own small life, stay in my small bubble. So they're either extremely depoliticized or extremely politicized. And with that extreme politicization comes anger, reaction, bitterness, resentment. That's also unhealthy. We are a very angry society. When you are so angry, you lose the ability to develop coexistence. That's what we're losing in Turkey. Civil society. But it's not only Turkey. I mean, I see similar patterns in Hungary, in Poland, of course in different degrees. I think overall, In the past, we used to think that there were some parts of the world that were more liquid, more volatile, turbulent, but the Western world was regarded as quite stable and safe. After 2016, I think that notion has been shattered a lot. Now we all know that we're living in liquid times, and what's happening in one part of the world can affect us in another part of the world. Yeah? And now we know that history doesn't necessarily go forward, sometimes it goes backwards. And I think this is an age in which emotions are very important. So when I say emotions, there's definitely anger, but also anxiety. It's an age in which there's a lot of anxiety.
There's that phrase, emotional intelligence, which is one that we need to bring back. I think this idea of trying to gather greater emotional intelligence.
It makes me sad to see populist demagogues are much better at connecting with people's emotions than many liberals and Democrats. I can't understand this, because they understand the power of emotions. And many people who have anxieties feel a little bit belittled by liberal intellectuals because their anxieties are not recognized. We have to be able to create spaces of freedom of speech where people can voice their anxieties. It's okay to have fear. What is not okay is to be guided by fear. I think we have to make that distinction. Of course, people can have anxieties about whether their children will have the same job opportunities. I'm a foreigner, I'm a nomad, but I can understand people who have fears about immigrants, whether, about losing their jobs. We should be able to talk about these issues. If we can't talk, we will be pushing people towards the lap of the far right. And that's another thing I am worried about. We should understand that not everyone who voted for Trump is an Islamophobe. Not everyone who voted for Brexit is a xenophobe. I might be critical of Brexit, but I should be able to connect with people who have voted for Brexit. If we lose these connections, I am worried that polarization will only work into the hands of populist demagogues because they benefit from polarization. We have seen it in Turkey, Whenever there's division, populist demagogues benefit from that.
I think all those words, all the last 5 minutes, we could put up banners across this room, and each of them, each and every one, is an incredibly wise and wonderful saying, something for us to all hold, and as we have our final glass of wine tonight, to think about. Because in many ways, I know that you weren't able to be here all day, but you've summed up our day, I think, perfectly. And also, I just want to thank you very much for our wonderful conversation. But congratulations on this really major prize. And thank you, all of you, so much for your generosity, and to Walter, and also to the translators who've been here all day. Thank you.
Thank you.